Hey, so I'm going to make a film review. As I say, with all the film reviews, there is spoilers in this. So if you haven't seen the film, you can stop watching now if you don't want some of the details to be discussed. The film is Suffragette. This is a historic film, and it stars. It's directed by Abby Morgan. Directed by Sarah Gavron and written by Abby Morgan. Um, and it basically focuses on the early stage of the women's suffrage movement in the United Kingdom. And it's set roughly between the years 1912 and 1913. That's the scope of the film. Um, it stars Carey Mulligan in the lead role, along with Helena Bonham Carter, Meryl Streep, Ben Whishaw, Brendan Gleeson, and Anne-Marie Duff. Um, in those respective roles, they are all fictional roles as far as I know, except for Meryl Streep, who plays Emmeline Pankhurst. There is also an appearance by Emily Davison, who was a real person, but I'm not sure what the actress is called who played that role. Those are the main roles. So this is a historical film, and it's focusing on the women's suffrage movement in this time. Um, I have to say, I was very impressed by this film. I thought it was a very intelligent film. It was not boring. It wasn't a slow moving film. It wasn't boring in that sense. In terms of the set design, in terms of the costumes and so on, it's one of the best period films I've seen in that sense. You can almost smell the vinegar in the air from sort of Edwardian London, just post-Edwardian. But it's in that sense, I think they've done an excellent job. Carey Mulligan's a great actress. I've seen her recently in Far From the Madding Crowd. She's definitely an up and coming star. Um, and the other roles, of course, Helena Bonham Carter and Meryl Streep are very established actresses. I should say the role that Meryl Streep plays as Emmeline Pankhurst is very brief, although obviously Emmeline Pankhurst is a central historical figure. Her role in the film is not the actual speaking role is not that long. She speaks from a balcony. She speaks to the central character. But basically, a bit of context here regarding the plot, the specific plot within the film. Um, it focuses on a group of working class women who are working in presumably some sort of textile factory in London. And they have a real brute of a boss. He's sort of sexually lecherous. He's a very rough, hard man, and it's very uncomfortable conditions. And the pretext is they work a third longer than the men and get paid less. So that's sort of the pretext or the context of this specific character plot. Um, what's interesting about the film is it's not a cliched film. It's not entirely as you would expect. What I mean by that is it's not a simple case that you sort of see this thing about, the women are all suddenly angry and they're demanding the rights and so on. It's a bit more ambiguous than this because, for example, throughout the film, some of those most vocal against the suffragettes are other women. In fact, in the street that Carey Mulligan's character Maud, she's called, in the street that she's on, other women are calling her a disgrace and shameful and so on. Another important backdrop to the film is a sort of police espionage campaign against them, leading on, um, and that focuses quite a lot on the police inspector. He's sort of an ambiguous character in the sense that although he's against the movement, he sort of you get the impression that there is a moral side to him. What I mean by that is he feels uncomfortable with some of the techniques being used on orders from the Home Office, such as the torture techniques like force feeding. There is a few scenes in this film that are quite hard to watch. That's definitely one of them. There's a force feeding scene, and that, of course, really did happen. Um, so this police inspector, played by Brendan Gleeson, he's working class himself, and there's one point you kind of get the impression that he's sort of not empathizing with the cause, but saying there's no point, you're not going to get anywhere. I'm trying to help you. That's his logic. Of course, history shows that that was wrong, but that's what one aspect I liked about this film. Likewise, it shows the division within the movement. So it wasn't a case that all the sisters are together. There is some tensions within the movement itself. For example, there's one point when the character played by Helena Bonham Carter advocates basically a direct action campaign, including firebombing. And there are some moral questions in that. For example, when they firebomb a minister's house, in the film they don't specify which minister. But anyway, the police inspector says that the housekeeper was on her way back. What would have happened to the cause if she had been killed or injured? So in that sense, I think it's a clever film. This is like any great civil rights film. It's like Selma and other films in that respect, in that it shows the complexities of some of the central characters, and I like that aspect. It humanizes them. It doesn't treat them as being superwomen, but it treats them as human, and I think that's a good aspect to the film. Another thing I liked about it was it wasn't a case of all the men in the film are bastards. For example, it shows that Helena Bonham Carter's husband is very much involved in the cause, and he too is under investigation for being an anarchist. Um, because there were men who supported the women's suffrage movement. Um, in fact, there was political divides as well, because at the time the Prime Minister was Herbert Asquith. He was opposed to women's suffrage. His Chancellor, David Lloyd George, was in support of it. And Lloyd George does feature in the film. Um, he is seen listening to the testimonies of the working conditions that the women go through. And then there's a scene where they see him as betraying them because he announces that the parliamentary vote was defeated. Um, and they call him a liar, which is interesting because he was one of those who was actually trying to advocate for that. But the point was, at the time, they were going up a very hostile parliament. Um, but to provide historical context, what actually happened was ultimately in 1918 there was partial suffrage for women, and then it wasn't until 1928 that there was full suffrage under the Baldwin administration, I believe. So it's an interesting film in providing some historical context. Now, the finale of the film is a very powerful scene, and I knew what was coming because I knew the historical backdrop. But even knowing what was going to happen was, it was a very, very well shot, moving scene, and that was the famous incident where Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's Horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913. And there's still footage of that from British Pathé. There's footage because it was being filmed. It was the Epsom Derby and it was the King's Horse. She died instantly, and her funeral became a real rallying point for the cause, because up until that point there'd sort of been an agenda by a large segment of the press, including many of those who were sympathetic to the conservative elements against, I don't mean party conservative, but socially conservative elements against change. It's incredible to think that Asquith was a liberal when he opposed this. It's worth remembering that William Gladstone also opposed women's suffrage. Um, I think it's a very clever film. Something interesting happened during the premiere, and that was a group of feminists ironically kind of hijacked the premiere and threw powder bombs that were green and purple, and they were escorted away. No, it wasn't as rough as the scenes in the film where women are brutally beaten up on Trafalgar Square, but Parliament Square, I should say. But there's some irony in that a film about the women's suffrage movement would be overshadowed by a feminist group. I've looked a bit into the background to that. Apparently, they were protesting government cuts against aid to domestic violence victims, which is a very serious subject. So this wasn't, the issue wasn't a trivial one. It wasn't like about some of the things that feminists make as their cause celebrate. This was an important issue. Helena Bonham Carter said that was ironic and counterproductive. And some of the other cast of the film expressed surprise at what happened. It certainly, I'm wondering, was that a way to get attention by specifically focusing on this film? I think it may have been. I'll say something else about the film. I think it's very important to have films about great social movements, and I'd like to see a lot more of them. You know, in recent years, we've had a lot of royal films in the UK. Now, don't get me wrong, those films are entertaining enough. They're good at what they do. But we've had so many. We've had The Young Victoria, The Queen, The King's Speech, A Royal Night Out, The Duchess. There's been so many films about royalty. Um, there's relatively few films about great social movements. In fact, I was just thinking earlier, when I think about films about the suffrage movement, I can't think of any. I honestly cannot think of any off the top of my head before this. I'm sure there must have been some, but that indicates that this is maybe something that hasn't been shown in film as much as it should have been. I mean, there's been references to it, for example, Sister Suffragette and Mary Poppins, that sort of thing. But this is the first serious film I've ever seen about the women's suffrage movement. I'd like to see a lot more along this sort of thread. I'd like to see one, for example, about the Chartists, or about the Great Reform Act. These are all great film subjects, and budding directors out there, I hope they can get the green light to make those sort of films. Not only does it bring about historical interest, it brings about all sorts of things, but it's a very, very key, important part of our history. It was featured, of course, in the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. Um, so, in conclusion, I thought this was a very good film. The trailers didn't really give a lot away. The trailer I saw basically just showed Carey Mulligan looking in a shop window, and then Anne-Marie Duff's character smashing a stone through the window. Anne-Marie Duff is sort of the character um, that brings Carey Mulligan into the cause, but barely gives anything away. There is one irony that I noticed in the film. They show that her character is denied access to her young son, and eventually her husband, Ben Whishaw, I think, plays that role. By the way, he is sort of he's in a somewhat difficult position, partly brought on by himself, but it's very much in the context of the time. He's kind of ridiculed by other men for letting his wife join the cause. He feels humiliated by it. He's never violent towards her, but he definitely doesn't support her either, and he prevents her seeing her young son. Those were all powerful scenes, but I could not help thinking that today actually the reverse has happened, whereby men are prevented from seeing their children. Um, but you know, I don't want to get too political in this video. Anyway, it's a very good film. It's a strong cast. Incidentally, Helena Bonham Carter, ironically, is a great granddaughter of Asquith himself. So that's an interesting connection that she has. Also, Ben West, I think his name's Ben West, Samuel West plays the role of a government minister. And that's interesting because in real life, he's pretty left wing and socialist, but very often in film, he's played the role of toffs. And just a little thing that I noticed. Some other supporting roles include, doesn't mention who played David Lloyd George. Oh, Adrian Schiller as David Lloyd George. Um, he was okay as Lloyd George, but I, you know, I've seen better Lloyd Georges, but he was okay at the role. Ben Whishaw played her husband, central character's husband. Romola Garai, Natalie Press. Natalie Press played Emily Davison. Meryl Streep, like I say, plays Emmeline Pankhurst, but it's a relatively small role. Helena Bonham Carter plays Edith Ellen, who is fictional, but she's somewhat inspired by Edith Garud. And Bonham Carter modelled her performance after Garud. A few more details about the film. It's produced by Alison Owen, written by Abby Morgan. The music's by Alexandre Desplat. Distributed by Focus Features. It's a British film. Budget of 14 million. So far, it's only made 8.9 million. I hope it does better than that because I thought it was a very, very strong film. Um, and yeah, so there has been some criticism of the film that the role of Meryl Streep as Emmeline Pankhurst was misleading because it's a relatively small role in the film where she's on all the posters. Um, Another interesting feature is it's the first film ever to be shot within the Houses of Parliament. That surprises me. I thought, for example, part of the Iron Lady was filmed there, but apparently not. This is the first film ever filmed within the Houses of Parliament. So anyway, that is my review of Suffragette. Out of 10, I'd give this about 8. I'm pleased I watched it. I think it's a good film. I can't really think of any criticism off the top of my head, but no film is perfect. Um, I mean, if there would be one thing, it would be the film was a little bit of an obscure ending because it sort of was Emily Davison's death, and then her funeral, and that was kind of cut off, and then that there was a writing. It also finished in the credits with various years that countries got women's suffrage. There was one part of that I'm going to need to research. It's 1949 China. Well, no one has the vote in China, so I'm not quite sure if that's accurate. I'm going to have to look that one up. And then one that stood out, 2015, women are promised a vote in Saudi Arabia. Well, we'll see. Um, I've deliberately chosen not to discuss in detail feminism today or anything like that because I want to make this a film review, and I've made plenty of plenty of videos about that subject. It doesn't change my view on modern feminism and some of the approaches that modern feminism uses. Although it is a powerful reminder of what women went through to get that basic human right. And in many parts of the world, women still suffer horrendous injustice. So it is an eye-opening film, and it's a powerful film. And Carey Mulligan's a great actress. I mean, so are the others, but I think her performance does stand out.